Hello everybody and welcome back to Odin's movie blog. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today I'm going to be doing a video that I've been doing some research for the past few days because, as you all should know at this point, especially if you've been reading the comments, I've had a lot of trolls coming in, MCU, DCEU fanboys just coming in there trying to say, oh my gosh, you have no idea what you're talking about, oh my gosh, you're so hateful, etc, etc, etc. And so I decided to actually do some research and actually give you a definitive answer as to the battle that is occurring between the MCU and the DCEU. Now, let me just start off, by making it very clear. The battle is very, very one-sided in many situations. However, we must understand full context in order to truly know what is going on not only in the MCU and its future, but also currently in the DCU and its future. And I hope that what I'm able to do today is able to put to rest all of the nonsense that's been put on in the comments of the videos. But of course, it probably won't, because, idiots will be idiots, asshats will continue to be asshats, and unfortunately there's nothing that I can do to change human nature. But let us just go by the actual numbers themselves. Some of these are going to be very obvious, but I did also do a little bit of digging to try and give you the most accurate numbers that I possibly can, just to show you how different the MCU and the DCEU are, but also which franchise, which series of films has been most successful by a film-by-film basis, and to talk about the current trends, because current trends usually determine the future reality of any franchise. So let's go ahead and dive into the numbers. So starting off, MCU began in 2008 with Iron Man. So Iron Man was the first film that came out in the MCU. The same year, we also got The Incredible Hulk. Both films did decent at the box office. Iron Man, of course, did much better than the Hulk did. The Hulk, technically, you could say, lost a little bit of money at the box office. However, because it has now been out since 2008, it's been out for over 11 years, tells us everything that we need to know about the fact that it's made money back when it comes to DVD and Blu-ray sales, and also I'm sure that they've also had other revenue streams to make up money for that. So no MCU film to this point has lost any money, starting all the way back to 2008. The DCU, with the current state, because some people will try and say, oh, well, The Dark Knight, etc. The Dark Knight is not a part of the DC extended universe. All of the DCEU films that we talk about, anytime that you hear those words, the DCEU or the DCU as it was before, I think they finally coined the DCU. Maybe they even have a different name for it now. I don't really care, because this is just easier to remember. But the current state of the films, the way that the films are constructed now, and the overall story arc that began was in 2013 with Man of Steel. So that means that the DCEU, as we know it today, as we know it now, started 5 years after the MCU. Had 5 years to see what the MCU was doing, how they were making their films, and therefore how to possibly be able to not only counteract and go against, but also probably get some advice about how they should approach movie making in general. Fortunately, it doesn't look like they decided to take that route. They decided to go on their own route, and for the very beginning, it just really didn't serve them very well. And that is not just my opinion. That is a bona fide fact when you look at the financials, but also when you look at audiences and critic scores as well. So anyway, let's talk about the actual production that's come out of this time period. So the MCU has produced 22 films in the past 11 years. 2 of those films have yet to be released. So, of course, this year we have both Endgame and also Captain Marvel coming out. And then some people are going to count the Spider-Man movie, but technically that is still a Fox property. It is, or rather, a Sony property. It is still not under the Disney label just yet. It is a movie that's been made in conjunction with Marvel Studios. Marvel Studios definitely has more creative control there, but it is still also a Sony product. We can't forget about that. So that's why I wouldn't really consider that to be fully an MCU film, but because that character exists within the MCU and the other films that are controlled by Disney and the Marvel Studios, obviously I would also still count it too. It's one of those half and half things, but only 2 official MCU films to be released this year, which would in total make it 22 films. So far, only 20 have actually been released, and that's when we do the box office numbers. That's the number that we're going to end up using in the process, is all the money that's been made in the 20 films that have already been released. And then we'll talk about the future of the MCU with those 2 unreleased films. The DCU, on the other hand, produced 8 films in the past 6 years, with 2 of them being unreleased, meaning that they've only made 6 films so far since 2013. Now, some people would say, oh yeah, that's about 1 a year. Yes, but you would think that if they're spending enough time to make one movie a year, that those films would therefore have the same kind of production and would have the same kind of benefit that the MCU has been able to get out of their films, and yet the MCU, doing 2 films a year, has been more successful. As I said, the only film to this point that has really lost any money was one of the first films they ever made in The Incredible Hulk, and ever since then, they have not made a movie that's lost money yet. And I'll get into a huge movie made by the DCU, or within the DCU, that did indeed lose money at the box office a little bit later. Alright, so now getting into some more nitty-gritty, getting to the actual numbers themselves. So when you take into account every single movie that's been released so far, all 20 films that have been released so far by the MCU, is grossed in total around $17.5 billion. So that means altogether, all 20 films have made about $17.5 billion, and that's on a budget on all 20 films of $3.9 billion. So that is a very, very good return on the investment. Again, you put in $4 billion, you get $17.5 billion back. That's pretty damn good. In fact, on average, the gross was $875 million, and the average cost was $195 million. So again, that's taking all the movies together, all 20 movies that came out that have been released so far, how much they spent on it production-wise, and therefore how much it also made back in the box office. Now, do keep this in mind. When you look at these numbers, these do not take into account marketing costs, and these do not take into account the 60% that they actually receive from box office returns. It still gives you a good indication, though, because it tells you that they didn't put in nearly as much as they returned on their investment for the variety of their films. So just keep that in mind. The DCEU, on the other hand, is not looking nearly as good. So the DCEU has grossed $4.83 billion on a budget of $1.23. So not nearly as good of a return on the investment. However, the average gross has still been about $805 million per movie with a cost of $205 million. So what's interesting about this is the fact that not only is the DCEU spending more on average per film than the MCU. And again, the MCU is putting out 2 films a year, sometimes this year, technically 3 films this given year, while the DCEU has only been giving out basically 1 film every single year. This is telling us a very interesting story because it means they're spending more on that 1 film, but they're not getting the same level of return that the MCU has been able to do with twice as much content over a shorter period of time. So to me, this really is the telling thing that anyone that tries to say that the MCU is somehow not as good as the DCU, financially speaking, that is just completely inaccurate. I mean, financially speaking, the MCU has whooped the DCU's ass, and it's not just the fact that it's made $17.5 billion, but the fact that you have 17.5 to 4 versus 4 to 1. That's definitely a huge difference in return on investment based on what you put into the film and what you get out of it. And obviously the DCU is going in a much better direction nowadays. However, we still cannot ignore the past. We still cannot ignore the universe that all the future films are still going to be a part of in the end. And there is no doubt, there's no question that the MCU is doing much, much better when it comes to financial returns than the DCU is, though. And also the DCU spending more per film. So that's not actually a very good thing and not a good statistic to look at. But remember, this is without any marketing cost or the actual gross of the overall films themselves. So let's get into some critic scores. So the infamous Rotten Tomatoes. So I'm sure that I'm going to get people on both sides saying, oh my gosh, Rotten Tomatoes, they're MCU shills, they're DCU shills, and you can keep crying and whining all you want. That's why I gave you 2 different scores here, and I think it's very telling. So the MCU, when you take all 20 films that have been released so far, the average critic score for all 20 films, 84.15%. That is high. That means 84.1% of critics liked the 20 films that came out. That is the average score and ranking. In addition to that, you see an extremely close audience score of 83.25%. So not only is this doing well with critics, not only is the MCU loved by critics for the most part, but also the audiences like the film too. Love the film, in fact, when you have all films together. Now let's look at the DCEUs on Rotten Tomatoes. So the DCEU average of critics is 51.2%. So critics obviously have a huge issue with the films, but guess what? Yes, you see a 20% increase and jump when you look at the audience score, which is at 72.8%, but that is still not even close to what the MCU fan base is. So what does this tell us? It tells us not only are these films that are being produced by the DC universe, by Warner Brothers, not being received well critically, but even the audiences themselves are at best mixed on the movies overall. I know that I myself have not liked many of the DC movies that have come out. And it's not because I'm a Marvel fanboy. I mean, I can tell you movies that I hated from the MCU. I think my least favorite of all time is Age of Ultron. I hate that movie. That's a movie that I never want to go back and watch because I don't think it's very good. So I can have a valid opinion on the DC universe because guess what? I'm a critic who tries to stay as objective as I possibly can, and the fact is that the movies that have been made so far by Warner Brothers that have led up to this point since 2013, again, since that 2013 start point, so don't go back further than that with Christopher Nolan, because Christopher Nolan movies are on a whole other level. There's no one here in their right mind would ever say that The Dark Knight or Batman Begins are not better than anything that Marvel Universe has put out so far, because I would put Dark Knight over every single film, even Infinity War, and even my favorite, Winter Soldier. I would still put Dark Knight over all those films, and then guess what? That's a DC property. So for anyone trying to say, oh, you're a Marvel fanboy, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But also, too, you still have to make a point that the audience score, even though you could easily get a bunch of your fans to come together, all the fanboys come together and unite and have the DC Universe's average score be even higher than this, it's not happening. It's not happening. So even audiences are not liking the DC Universe. So if you're trying to say that all audiences are biased against the MCU, I'm sorry, but there's, again, look at the financials, look at the audience rating. Again, this is a rating that you can easily control. And some people might ask, why are you just using Rotten Tomatoes? Why aren't you using other scores? The reason why is because Rotten Tomatoes has the largest number. So when you compare this to, for example, IMDb or to Metacritic or any other major sites, Rotten Tomatoes usually has the highest numbers, not just from critics, but also from audience as well. So this, to me, is the fairest way to compare these two films. So once again, the numbers speak for themselves, people. All right, so let's get into some more numbers here. So when we look to what is the highest grossing film that has come out from both companies. So the highest grossing MCU film, no doubt and no question, no surprise here, it was indeed Infinity War that came in at over $2 billion worldwide, which is absolutely insane. But how much money did it actually make for the company? Well, the total cost of the film was $482 million, so that's both production and also counting in the marketing costs as well. The actual box office, seeing that the MCU, Disney, Marvel only get 60% of the box office returns, so 60% of that $2 billion would be about $1.22 billion. So that is how much it actually got. But then you've got to subtract how much money it invested in the film, that 482, which means the actual gross was $742 million. So that is a very, very good return on the investment. Again, well over, very close to even just $1 billion on itself. So it's very easy for us to always look at the numbers and say, look, 2 billion versus 1 billion, but that doesn't really tell us the whole story because you have to understand how much money they put into the film and also how much, therefore, they received on it. So again, the biggest movie at this point is $2 billion. They made 742 in actual net gain, an actual profit. The highest grossing film in the DCEU is actually a film that just came out this past December. Again, it took until Aquaman. It took all of those years. It took 6 years for them to make a film finally that breached the $1 billion mark. And so that is something that, again, you cannot simply ignore. It does show that there have been issues with the DCEU, not only in getting critics to love it, but also audiences as well. Because guess what? Audiences speak with their wallets. So again, if any of the fanboys are going to come in there and say, oh my God, you're just a shill, blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the numbers, guys, and I'm just telling you how things actually are. So again, Aquaman is definitely, without any shadow of a doubt, by about $200 million. So by a large amount, the highest grossing DCU film, and it's at $1.1 billion as of today. Again, that's about rounded up at this point. Keep in mind that this film is indeed still out, and so therefore it's still making money. It opens up in Japan February 8th, and so therefore that's probably going to be another 50 to at tops $100 million that's going to be added to it. So by the end of its run, it could easily be at the $1.2, $1.3 billion range, and I think that it definitely will. Again, I gave it a C+ because I didn't think the movie was as amazing as people are saying. I think that people looked at it and said, oh, look, it's a DCEU film that's actually fun, that I actually want to go see a second time. That's been a rare thing. Again, I'm sorry, look at the audience score once again. It's something that has been very common and something that has been universally accepted by most audiences. Just accept the reality, guys. The total cost of that film was $300 million, so much less than what it cost to make Infinity War. The actual box office, though, was $660 million, which means that the actual gross was $360 million. And so what you see there is that the biggest movies that each company had, the MCU doubled what the largest DCU film is. So as I said, the numbers speak for themselves. MCU not only is getting more money back on its investment, is also spending on average less, and is kicking its ass, kicking the DCU's ass when it comes to a head-to-head battle between the top two films for both companies. Something that we can't ignore, something that we must always keep in our minds. All right, so that was talking about the current state of these things, but let's talk about what is the current, what is the future of both companies looking like? What is the future of the MCU and the DCU? And this is where the DCU fans might actually be happy with what I'm saying, and the MCU fans have been giving me all the hate, saying, how can you say, I mean, look at all those numbers. They're going to say, look, you proved it yourself that the MCU is doing great. How can you possibly say that it's not going to do well? Well, trust me, I've got numbers on that as well. But let's talk about the upcoming MCU. So we have the next MCU film that's going to be coming out this year is indeed Captain Marvel. The first film, Endgame, has just, you know, so much hype behind it. Don't really need to talk about it. But Captain Marvel has moderate hype at best and also a bit of concern. In fact, on Rotten Tomatoes, the interested in score is at 92%. That's actually on the lower end of a film like this, which makes you understand that there is indeed a little bit, at least a little bit. I mean, come on, guys, you need to at least admit there is a tiny bit of speculation. There's a tiny bit of concern going on behind the scenes. And I'll tell you why there's concern in a second. But still, when you compare this to Shazam, which is the next DCEU film, there's not as much hype because it's a smaller property. It's not going to make a crap ton of money. I think by the end of its run, it could potentially make more than Captain Marvel. However, at this point, I'm not going to say that. At this point, and people are going to say, oh my gosh, you said that it's going to make more. No. At this point, I still think Captain Marvel is going to make more money because I think the audiences are going to be so hyped for Endgame that there might be, enough hype for Endgame to help Captain Marvel out. Now, of course, that still remains to be seen. With that being said, though, Shazam is still going to make money. It's still going to be a profitable film, and it still has a lot of support behind it. And 95% of people on Rotten Tomatoes want to go see it and also are excited for it. There's no controversy. There's none. It just looks like fun. And it's also interesting that the original Captain Marvel is actually Shazam, and, Captain Marvel eventually got the name and the moniker because of a, lawsuit, etc. And we'll get into that in a little bit as to the current state of Captain Marvel and why that's a problem. So anyway, conclusion. What does all this mean? All these numbers and all this thing I'm talking about. I've been hyping up these numbers for a very long time. So what does this all mean? So I typed it out on here. The MCU is clearly dominant not only in profit, but also in critical and audience reception. Again, the numbers speak for themselves. You cannot debate that. There is no question the MCU is on top. But where is that trend? So again, it's on top now. But where are the trends going? We must remember that Disney's Star Wars went from constant gains of $2 billion, $1 billion, and 1.3. That's $2 billion for Force Awakens, $1 billion for Rogue One, and 1.3 for The Last Jedi. But it went from that, constantly making money, breaking the $1 billion mark, to then losing $200 million with Solo: A Star Wars Story, making only $392 million at the box office. And much of this blame comes from The Last Jedi Fallout, which, I'm sorry, you kind of can't ignore it at this point. You don't lose that much money. You don't have a Star Wars movie that's the first movie ever to lose money unless there's something else going on, unless the fans do not want to support that film. And why would the fans not want to support it? Oh, wait a minute, that's right. Because of the reaction that came out of The Last Jedi. But still, what this shows is that you have a company in Star Wars that people said, it's never going to lose money. Oh, Star Wars is doing great. But look, it went from $2 billion, $1 billion, $1.3 billion to $392 million to a $200 million loss. So for anyone that's trying to say the MCU is completely immune from any possibility of it eventually falling or failing, I'm sorry, but history just doesn't back you up there. Now, am I saying that it's extremely likely? No, I would say that it's potentially. I would say it's possibly likely at this point, and I'll get into why when I talk about a little bit more about Captain Marvel. But still, the point of all this is to show that is indeed possible. Captain Marvel is following a massive success in Infinity War, but has also led to early controversy for its woke star Brie Larson and her white male opinions don't matter. If anyone didn't catch that, Brie Larson at one point, she was speaking in public and said that she does not care what old white men have to say about A Wrinkle in Time. Basically saying that what an old white man has to say about any given movie doesn't matter because of their gender and the race that they are. Saying that somehow affects the validity of their opinion, which I just think is ridiculous. But also, too, she has doubled down on this and has said other things, too, in the past to kind of have this kind of woke mentality. So she is already not really having a positive light among many Marvel fans. Now, am I saying most or all? No, but I'm saying that there's a pretty good chunk of people that are not excited for this movie. And you can check the comments out for yourself of people saying, yeah, I don't really want to support her. Because not only does she have no charisma on screen, but also, too, she said all this stupid stuff that I don't want to support. While at the same time, there is nothing negative surrounding Shazam, and it follows a huge success for the DCEU and Aquaman that is still making money and opens in Japan. Again, February 8th is when that opens. So we have one film coming off of a $2 billion movie, and of course that would be Captain Marvel. It's also coming off of Ant-Man and the Wasp, which also had a respectable $400 to $500 million total gross by the end of its run. So still two very successful movies that made money. However, controversy can sink a film. Controversy can have an impact on a film. And that's the reason why you have one franchise and one film that seems to be indicating a potential for a spoiler, while the other company, the DCEU, is actually coming off a huge success, making crap ton of money, flying in the face of the critics themselves, who hated all over Aquaman, but also, too, there is no controversy over Shazam. Shazam looks like a crap ton of fun. So there's nothing that's going to hold that back in a lot of ways. Yes, Disney is in a good financial spot for the most part when it comes to its film output, but that is only part of the story. As Star Wars shows, nothing is ever guaranteed and audiences can be driven away at any time for a variety of reasons. So yes, even though the MCU is producing, even though the MCU has not had a flop yet, has not lost money yet, with that exception being, of course, that first release when it came to The Incredible Hulk, it's still possible. Because guess what? The same thing happened with Star Wars. In fact, Star Wars didn't just lose money with Solo. For the first time, I think, almost ever, Disney, in its financial reports, again, you can look this up for yourself, admitted to losing money when it came to marketing and also when it came to merchandising as well. So Disney Star Wars, again, still under the Disney umbrella, is on the way down. And a lot has to do with the fact that a lot of people that started to run that franchise became very woke, became more focused on an actual agenda rather than telling a coherent story. And it's very easy to see that happening also, to an extent, with Captain Marvel, with the future of the MCU, with some words from Kevin Feige. And has the MCU gone woke yet? That is the biggest question. And there are some people that are going to say yes, there are going to be some people that say no. And so my answer is, well, maybe not yet, but Disney campaigning for Black Panther for an Oscar consideration over better films. Again, Disney focused all of its attention. Again, Disney released a lot of films last year, and yet it only focused on one, Black Panther. And the reason why it focused on it for Oscar contention is because, sorry, you can't, this is just a fact, guys, I'm sorry, you can't ignore this, is because of the race of the cast. So you already have that happening. You already have the early concerns over Captain Marvel, specifically because of words that Brie Larson has said. And also you have words said by Kevin Feige, the head of the MCU, who says, you have words by MCU Kevin Feige that should keep the fans of the MCU cautious, because he is someone who has said outright that he thinks the future is going to be diversity. And once again, there's nothing wrong with diversity in itself. Diversity in and of itself is completely absent of morality. It's neither good nor bad. But when you have the head of the MCU trying to say the future is going to be Captain Marvel, is going to be, focused on this agenda, it does leave you to have to caution. It does leave you to have to understand, are they going to try and focus too much on the agenda, or are they going to continue to try and make good films? I think that one could argue either point at this, this time. But what this does is it allows for the DCEU fans under Warner Brothers to be optimistic, which is why I would rather be the DCU right now than the MCU, but that can easily change. So some people, and this is really basically what ties up everything together, is that the reason why I was getting so much hate recently was because I said that I would rather be a DCU fan, or I'd rather be a part of the DCU right now than the MCU. And the reason why, as I hopefully you can see, is not necessarily because of financials. Again, the MCU is still very much on top financially. But when it comes to the immediate future, and this can easily change at any point, when it comes to the immediate future of both franchises, one has no controversy over it, is coming out in the wake of a very successful, the most successful DC film to date in Aquaman and Shazam following it, while the MCU is in a much different position. The MCU is dealing with not only Kevin Feige coming out and talking about this and warning a lot of people that he's going to basically do the same thing that Kathleen Kennedy did over with Star Wars, and we see what happened to Star Wars after that, but also, too, because of the choice of some of their characters. Again, we look to the fact that they did this giant push for Black Panther, but also the choice of Captain Marvel as a character is also interesting. And we have this over at the Hollywood Reporter, which is by no means a, bastion of alt-right conservatism, which I love getting those comments, because like, you obviously have no idea what any of those things mean, because it's just complete nonsense. But anyway, let's talk about who Carol Danvers actually is. Carol Danvers, the current captain, started life as a supporting character for Marvel's first Captain Marvel, introduced in Marvel Superheroes number 13. She was a U.S. Air Force pilot and potential love interest for the hero who eventually got sidelined following an accident during one of Marvel's adventures. So, Captain Marvel's character, the current Captain Marvel, again, Carol Danvers, she was a supporting character for a very long time. Meaning the actual Captain Marvel himself was a different character. Danvers continued as Miss Marvel. So the reason why that happened is because at some point in 1977, you had a situation where Marvel and Carol Danvers were in an explosion, combined together genetically speaking, and so therefore she took the superhero identity Miss Marvel. So Miss Marvel started in 1977. Danvers continued as Marvel on and off for the next 3 decades. She also briefly went by the names Warbird and Binary during that era, and also spent time disempowered and without memory, but such things are common in comics, before taking on the Captain Marvel mantle to much fanfare with 2012's Captain Marvel 1. The series was relaunched again this year. So what does this tell me? It tells me that the Captain Marvel that we're getting on the big screen has only been around since 2012. Now, obviously, there is a huge library of information that they can use to try and talk about her origins, to talk about Marvel, to talk about all this stuff. But they're going with Captain Marvel, which has only been around since 2012. They're potentially ignoring some of the major parts of her history and her background. And also, too, it's interesting that this character sounds like has had to undergo tremendous amounts of recharacterization and reboots. And to what I've been told by friends who read comics, her comic is not doing well because the people writing it at this point are pushing political agendas into their stories instead of telling a good comic book story. And so that's the reason why I think a lot of us are worried, because if that's the current state of the comic, if we have a movie called Captain Marvel and it's going to be based off the 2012 Captain Marvel, with the current state of that writing and the current state of that agenda, does that mean that that is going to come into the film? Now, some people would say Kevin Feige's not going to allow that to happen. It's going to be fine. But hopefully you can see that it is still something that we should worry about. Because as we saw with Star Wars, it's very easy for you to put an agenda over a story and for that to cause an entire universe to crumble apart. And as it continues, a curious thing happened when Carol Danvers became Captain Marvel. The character became viral for the first time in her existence. Again, became viral for the first time in her existence, 2012. Following the promotion of the 2012 series, complete with a stylish new costume designed by artist Jamie McKelvey, the character found herself at the center of something called itself the Carol Corps, a loosely organized, predominantly female fan base that vocally supports the series and its writer Kelly Sue DeConnick, pushing to create a safer space for women inside comic fandom. It's not an exaggeration to suggest that the Carol Corps is at least partly responsible for the Captain Marvel movie announcement. Through the online efforts of that fandom in particular, the character has become a figurehead for Marvel Publishing's attempts to diversify its audience and expand its reach, even as other female leads outsell the Captain Marvel series on a regular basis. With today's announcement, Captain Marvel crosses over to take on the same role for Marvel Studios, combined with the news of Marvel's first solo featuring a non-white lead. Marvel is finally stepping outside of its comfort zone and into the relative unknown. So hopefully this really does make it very clear to you that Captain Marvel as a movie is coming about because of a group called the Carol Corps, a predominantly female fan base trying to create a safe space in comic fandom for women. And this is all a part of the fact that it has been outsold by almost every other comic, including other female-led comics. And one can only imagine that's because of an obvious political agenda here to try and push for something that many comic readers don't want. So hopefully this reveals why I have my concerns for the future of the MCU. Hopefully this reveals why I personally am more excited for the real Captain Marvel, Shazam. Because up until like the 1960s or 1970s, Shazam as the character was known as Captain Marvel. And then Marvel, of course, sued them because of the name use and etc. And then eventually was transferred over. However, what we see here is a very clear attempt at potentially driving down the MCU with identity politics. And if that happens, you know, as the numbers for Star Wars showed, it's going to be very, very easy, very easy for the MCU to go in the same direction. 2 billion, 1 billion, 1.3, 392, $200 million loss. If it can happen to Star Wars, it can happen to the MCU. And those are just those are just the facts. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching. Sorry this is a little bit long, but I wanted to make sure to be as clear and concise as possible. I wanted to give you all the numbers, all the background, but also to explain myself as to why I've been so critical of Captain Marvel, to explain why I am concerned about the future of the MCU because of that film, because of the political motivation and machine that seemed to be behind not only the film coming into existence, but also that character alone as Captain Marvel coming into existence in 2012. So hopefully I've explained things. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, smash that like button. Share it as well. Again, I try to be as concise and as, you know, as descriptive as possible. So please share it if you think that other people might need to know and understand why there's this battle between the MCU and DCEU, and also what the current state of those franchises are, and why the MCU is actually probably in the most precarious situations over Shazam at this point. Again, I'm not saying that in the long term that it's going to make much of a difference, but I think that concern is still needed. That's just me, though. Anyway, guys, thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day, and as always, God bless.